the team members from the Dasgupta Review, represented by Emily McKenzie. I'll introduce Emily in a moment. And her other members of the review team, Lucy and Felix, are also online to handle questions during the discussion. Just a quick look at the makeup of people we've had interested in this webinar. The numbers are still pushing up towards the 200 mark. We had obviously more than that always register for these things, but you can see these were the registrations yesterday, and as usual with UKNEE, the mix of consultancy, academic, public sector, business participants making up the environmental economics community, and I'm pleased to say drawn not just from the UK but all around the world, which is a real strength of our network. To introduce Emily, I'm sure she'll introduce herself a bit more, but I had the pleasure of working with her on the Natural Capital Protocol 5 years ago now, and our brief in that work was actually an order of magnitude increase in businesses using natural capital thinking. And I can see echoes of that in the outputs from the Dasgupta Review of trying to have an order of magnitude increase in economists using environmental thinking. Or maybe Emily will be able to characterize it more accurately than that. So I'll hand over to her, and thank you, Emily, for your time today.
It's a pleasure, Ian. Thanks. So I'll just share my screen.
And while you're doing that, Emily, I just actually remind people we're going to be recording the webinar today and making it available so people can see your presentation and the discussion that follows.
Great, thank you. Can you see my slides, Ian, and hear me okay?
Yes.
Great,
all
fantastic.
Clear. Great,
I'll get going. So yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much to Ece and Ian for inviting me and the team to give a webinar today. UKNEE was actually one of my first conferences I was remembering many years ago, so it feels good to be back to speak to this community. And I also see on the list of participants names of people who've helped with the review along the way, giving evidence to our call for evidence and supporting us with many chats and discussions. So I'm going to start by saying thank you for all the help this community has already provided. So Professor Dasgupta, and I'll call him Partha throughout, he said in the past that most economists are not familiar with ecology. And despite having worked in environmental economics for a long time and knowing the excellent work that the many people on this call have been involved in, I do agree with Partha. After graduating from economics, I entered with a good working understanding of economics, but had little understanding of ecology, little understanding of how to apply it to environmental problems, and nothing to do with the environment was actually on the syllabus for my economics degree. So it wasn't even an option. And then working as an environmental economist, I found pools of great people to work with who are doing great economics in an interdisciplinary way, but I've felt growing frustration with how infrequently that happens, despite the pools of good people like those on this call. So as Ian was getting at with the example from the Natural Capital Protocol, I think with his review, Partha hopes to make an increase to help address this gap. And he set out what he thinks it means to bring biodiversity to the heart of economics, building on the work of many others. And in doing so, he hopes to engage many more economists in the economics of biodiversity, both applied economists in economics and finance ministries like the Treasury, but also in academia. And he strongly believes in the influence of academia on policy, the connection between the two. So to use Partha's words, what he feels his review is offering is a grammar. He'll often use that term grammar to enable and encourage all economists to discuss economic issues with a really strong understanding of ecology and related earth sciences as central to their understanding, to their language, and to their remit. So it's sort of like a mental apparatus for thinking about the problem deeply and broadly. And in doing so, he does hope to inspire and inform action, and we'll talk about the options for change that we get through in the review. So my name's Emily McKenzie, and today I'll give you a short talk about the Dasgupta Review. I'm hoping to speak for about 25-30 minutes and have 25-30 minutes for discussion. And I'm joined by Felix and Lucy, who'll be contributing to the discussion. We're part of an independent review team that's had the privilege and pleasure of supporting Partha on this review. And I think we feel the review is really important because, and I'm sure you share it, so I won't dwell on it, but that biodiversity loss is essentially an economic and finance issue. It presents economic and financial risks, and economics has many of the tools to solve the problems, and many of the tools that you're already experts in. So in this webinar, what I'll do is cover three core areas to help you give a deeper, try and give you a deeper understanding of the review, and Ian was saying this when we were just starting, get below the headlines a bit. And I hope also to instill in you the belief that it's a useful contribution. I really believe it is. I'm going to structure the review around three buckets. So I'll give an overview of the review's overarching framework. I'll give a bit of a deeper dive into the economic concepts and models, given this is a economists network. And then I'll very briefly cover the recommendations, what we call our options for change. And in doing that, and in the conversation that follows, I just want to say that please chime in with anything. We want to address misunderstandings or preconceptions or fears you might have about the review. I want to be very clear about what it does and what it doesn't. There are lots of things it doesn't do. And along the way, maybe we can give some insights about Partha's thinking and motivations. So after the presentation, I'll show, we have a team email address. I'll also provide my personal email address. We'd love to know what you learned from this, what you think is useful from the review, how it's relevant to you, what made you think about things in new ways, because part of us doing this outreach is both to increase understanding and awareness of the review, but also to understand how people see it as relevant to them for the next phase of work. So we won't be able to cover everything. I know there's a large number of people on the webinar, but do get in touch with us directly if you had questions or comments afterwards that we couldn't get to. And I'm hoping you'll also read the review after we've spoken, if you haven't already. So I know it's long, and most people I now speak to give guilty confessions that they're excited about the review, but they haven't read all 600 pages. So that's fine, but I do hope you will after we've given you a bit of a taster. And there's the abridged version, which is 100 pages. That's a good first step, but there really is so much in it. It's very hard to do justice to everything. So I hope you'll read it and discuss it with your colleagues. So that's my introduction. Before I start, though, I just want to make one thing clear to stress that the material we're going to provide in this webinar does not represent the view of the UK Treasury or the UK government. Felix and Lucy and I are here presenting our roles in the independent review team supporting Partha Dasgupta. So hopefully that's clear. So just very briefly, just one slide on context for people who are completely new to the review. So I'm sure many of you are aware of and have probably been deeply involved in the many studies that have already made clear the extent and speed of biodiversity loss and how this poses risks to our economies and our well-being. The TEEB report, the UK's National Ecosystem Assessment, the recent global assessment and other assessments of IPBES, there are many that we're building on the shoulders of. But as I noted in my introductory remarks, and I'd be interested to know if people agree, I think the economic consequences of biodiversity loss are often misunderstood or overlooked. And that's why, back in spring of 2019, the UK Chancellor commissioned a global independent review, and emphasize it's global, so it's commissioned by the UK, but with a remit to look globally at the issue on the economics of biodiversity. And then in the UK, we have two types of review. You can have a government review or an independent review. An independent review, once commissioned by the government, is truly independent, and the independent reviewer can set out his thoughts on the issue. And in this case, that's led by Professor Partha Dasgupta. He's Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge, who has led this work. And in a nutshell, what does it do? So the review explores the sustainability of humanity's engagements with nature and provides a comprehensive framework for thinking about biodiversity. I think what I've really been impressed with is how it's grounded in a really deep understanding of ecology, of ecosystem processes, how they're affected by economic activity, and how those same activities depend on ecosystems. So the review takes economics very seriously, but it also takes the ecology and the underlying science extremely seriously. So In this first bucket of the presentation, as I said, I'll just give the overall framework for the review. So at its core, the review sees biodiversity loss as an asset management problem. So first, nature is an asset, just like produced capital or human capital. Natural assets produce a flow of goods and services over time, and I know many of you have worked on ecosystem services and natural capital for a long time, so that's not a new idea, but for many others, it is a new idea. So I won't go through all the different ecosystem services that we get from them, but you'll know the list, I'm assuming. And what's interesting is that in the framing, biodiversity is a characteristic of those natural assets, ecosystems being a useful way of breaking down those assets, thinking about them as units, and biodiversity as a characteristic of those assets. And the review draws on the wealth of science that shows that biodiversity is this essential characteristics of nature that makes it productive in producing ecosystem services, resilient, and able to adapt in the face of change. And we use this analogy, if any of you saw our launch, His Royal Highness Prince Charles used the same analogy, that just as diversity within a financial portfolio, it reduces the risk and uncertainty across financial returns, so financial asset managers will be very familiar with that. Greater biodiversity reduces risks and uncertainty within a portfolio of natural assets. And so finally, thinking of nature as an asset means realizing that all of us are asset managers through our spending and our investment decisions. And investment, I mean writ large, what we do with our time, what we do with our money, what we do with our actions. So it may not always be consciously, but all of our decisions determine the mix of natural, human, and produced capital. And so although a core target audience for the review is economics and finance decision makers, it also speaks more broadly to all of us as citizens or as business managers, as people working in government. All of us, our actions have an effect. So the review argues within this asset management framing that we've collectively failed to manage our global portfolio of assets well, and global capital counts show the extent of this mismanagement. So this chart shows estimates in a report you may be familiar with, the United Nations Environment Programme's Inclusive Wealth Report, of global per capita accounting values of the three classes of capital goods. So you're saying produced capital, human capital, and natural capital since the early 1990s. And you'll see that it shows that globally, produced capital per head has doubled, and even human capital per head has increased by about 13%. But the value of the stock of natural capital has declined by nearly 40%. And although it's well understood in the Treasury and other economics and finance decision-making bodies that you wouldn't deplete your produced capital because it would reduce your economy's productive capabilities, what we're seeing is that natural capital is being depleted in some cases to the points of collapse. So the review is informed by that asset management framing, but it also is very strongly based in a historical experience. I love the fact that Partha starts with the very first chapter, chapter 0, with deep history, starting from the beginning of time. It's particularly informed by recent history, particularly since 1950. And what the patterns that we're seeing in these charts. So it recognizes that recent history has in many ways been the best of times. So humanity has recently prospered at an absolutely unprecedented rate. And Partha always says it's through his lifetime, his generation has seen this happen. The global population has more than tripled. Our life expectancy has doubled. The average person has a far higher income and is much less likely to live in absolute poverty. And live significantly longer. So terrific. Many people have remarked on this. But the chart on the left is one of many graphs you could use. I wouldn't fixate on the indicator we've used. This is the Living Planet Index. You can see that there's a rub. So while the chart on the left shows the exponential rise in real GDP globally, since 1950, global economic output has increased 15-fold. There's a rub. The ways in which we've done that have come at the expense of nature. So as Partha says, that we're simultaneously living in the best and the worst of times. Biodiversity, I won't go over all the figures, but biodiversity is declining faster than any time in human history. Extinction rates are 100 to 1,000 times higher than average over the past several million years, and so on. And the Living Planet Index showing, I think, the latest statistics from the last Living Planet report, with decline in the population of species on average by 68%. So these stark figures show the relationship between the way we've produced this prosperity and its impacts on nature. And so to come to the sort of very central part of the framework of the review argues that this widespread and rapid environmental degradation, so in economic terms, Partha would call this depreciation of our natural assets, demonstrates a demand-supply imbalance. So we call this central part of the review's framework. It's covered in detail in chapter 4, for those of you who want to go do some reading, the impact equation. So the review asserts that what that pattern we've seen of loss over the last decades is an indication that the impact equation has consistently been, and I mean this like in mathematical terms, Partha keeps me up to speed with my maths, as an inequality. So this inequality you can see in the center of the planet here. It represents that our demands on nature for its services have for some time now outstripped its ability to supply those services on a sustainable basis. So the left-hand side represents humanity's demands globally, also sometimes called our ecological footprint. And it's useful to decompose this. So our demands are determined, this is at the aggregate scale, but you could disaggregate if you like, the size and composition of each of our individual demands on the biosphere, the number of people, so the size of the human population making those demands, and the efficiency with which we're converting nature's services to meet our own needs. And that's both through this sort of yin and yang of how we interact with nature, the extraction from the environment and the putting of waste back into the environment as a sink, which puts stresses on it. So that has been far greater, our demands have been greater than the right-hand side of the impact equation, which represents nature's supply. That's a function of the overall stock of our natural assets, that's S, and the biosphere's ability to regenerate. And we look at how natural assets are unique in that they can regenerate over time if undisturbed. So yeah, the review uses the impact inequality as a condition for sustainable development, bringing demands on nature back in line with its supply. And also, given the massive degradation that we've experienced, looks at risk and uncertainty, potentially needing to bring that in balance at a greater level of nature's supply than we have now. And it's fundamental to the review's recommendations, which you'll see when I get to that part, because it decomposes these different elements on both the demand and supply side. So you can think of any of these things, N or Y or alpha, G or S, as things that we and our policymakers and our businesses can be shifting to help bring this back in line and back into equality. So if we think about this as the review thinks of this as a persistent demand overshoot. It looks at this in the context of risk and uncertainty. How is this endangering the prosperity of current and future generations? Why does it matter? And looking at that through the lens of risk and uncertainty. So, just to re-emphasize what I said earlier and what will be obvious, I think, to many people on this call, we all rely on those natural assets for these services. Biodiversity loss is undermining that productivity, that resilience, and that adaptability of nature. And this is fueling this risk and uncertainty. And this is based on this understanding of ecology, chapter 3, for those of you who are going to go read, of ecosystem processes as being, as Partha calls them, non-linear. So the way I understand non-linear, I know it's much more sophisticated than this, but if you break an ecosystem up into smaller parts, the sum of their components would not be equal to the previous whole. You lose more as you split it up. And the review explores the science connected to this of ecosystem tipping points and regime shifts. So how ecosystems can shift to from biodiverse productive systems to poorer, less productive systems, and how these changes can be rapid and hard to predict, but have far-reaching consequences. We look at examples of how they're already manifesting themselves at local scales and signals of them at global scales during, for example, on the planetary boundaries work and examples of local tipping points. So one of the most powerful examples of those tipping points that we use others that you're probably aware of is the Amazon, with it, potential to shift to savanna and the huge consequences for the water cycle globally. And that there is some analysis in the review that suggests that low-income countries stand to lose the most from these tipping points. There's some analysis done by the universities of Minnesota and Purdue with the World Bank that looks at 3 potential tipping points: tropical forests, marine fisheries, and wild pollinators. And you can see that low-income countries, in terms of impacts on their output, because they rely so much on those, are affected the most. So Yeah, I won't go into all the nuances of this, but the review explores the significance of the fact that these changes are extremely hard to reverse, some cases impossible to do so, and the consequences in terms of lost option value, which many of you will be familiar with thinking around option value, and why, in many ways, all else equal, that leads to arguments for conservation being preferable to restoration because it allows us to keep our options open. So if you've heard Partha speak, you'll see he highlights 3 pervasive features of nature that make it very difficult to record comprehensively our use of and impacts on nature. He talks about it being mobile, does it very poetically, fish swim, winds blow, that it's also silent and invisible in many cases, the example of the biodiversity in the soils beneath our feet being a powerful image of that. And he emphasizes that these characteristics are what make it really difficult, or in some cases impossible, to account for all our use and impacts on nature. And that's what leads to these pervasive externalities. And that much of nature is open to all at no monetary charge. Again, this is bread and butter for environmental economists on the call, and they're not reflected, those true values are not reflected in market prices. And these pricing distortions have led us to that asset management problem. Right? So all of this, I'm sure for many of you, is very, very familiar thinking. I think what the review does that maybe goes, one step further than the kind of market failure framing is setting out this unsustainable engagement with nature being a broader institutional failure, not simply a market failure. In other words, our institutions have not successfully managed these externalities, and we can't rely on the market alone and pricing alone. So to make this real, we give a few concrete examples, but governments, for example, having exacerbated the pricing problem by paying people to exploit rather than to protect nature. And also the huge gap in institutional arrangements needed to protect global public goods, whether they're within a national jurisdiction like rainforests around the world, or outside of national jurisdictions like the open ocean. So those are 2 examples, but there are many more. And the review defines institutions broadly in quite a sort of academic way, not just simply an organization, but all the rules and arrangements that govern our collective undertaking. So it can vary. You see this beehive here, from households to markets, states and transnational organizations. But the review in particular highlights the role of what Partha calls communitarian institutions. That's the 2 at the bottom. So the importance of civil society and community at the base of the beehive. And he draws on a lot of empirical evidence from around the world, particularly in developing countries, that looks at the effectiveness of community-based institutions with communities and civil society actively involved to set up rules of engagement, ways of operating that are sustainable. And he also explores their fragility and what has caused them to fall apart in the past. And across all of this, you'll see at the top of the beehive, the review emphasizes the importance of trust and cooperation, social capital, if you like, to use that term, for institutions to be effective. So one question we get asked is where is social capital in the framework? And Partha positions produced, human and natural capital as the productive capital assets, but doesn't mean social capital is not important, because it's this glue that makes the institutions effective to fix the problem. And just further on the right, this diagram's showing, and Partha starts from sort of first principles based on game theory and game theoretic concepts, the importance for any institutions at any scale to have clear rules about what can and can't be done, for you to be able to observe and verify people are following those rules and effectively enforce them, and for there to be penalties or rewards for following those rules, for them actually to work. And that's quite a helpful, it's a high level, but it's a helpful lens for thinking about the effectiveness of institutions or their ineffectiveness at different scales. So that's broadly, and it's hard to do justice to the whole thing, but those are sort of some very high level important parts of the overall framework I wanted to convey. But I having spoken to Eche and Ian, I felt that this audience, some of you would be asking and want to know more about the review from an economic lens. So in this second part of my presentation, I'll just give a bit more detail on those core economic elements and of the framework. So the review, and this has caught a lot of people's imaginations in the headline and the Twitter sphere, about us starting from the understanding that the global economy is embedded in the biosphere, And Partha emphasizes that this view contrasts to what you would see often in standard macroeconomic models of growth and development, and that has implications for what actually constitutes sustainable growth and development. So Partha uses this image that standard models of economic development see us dipping in and out of nature, returning our waste back, and then able to leave without the consequences. But in reality, we can't. It's our home. And also he explores the repercussions of that view. If you see yourself as external to nature, it encourages the view that human ingenuity can raise global output indefinitely without affecting the biosphere, such that it might go to one of these sort of tipping points out of its current stability regime that we've seen in past centuries. So in contrast, the review draws on what we know about ecology, what we know about the reality of things, really, that our ecosystems are affected by economic activity. That includes this extraction of resources for our production and our consumption, and the waste we produce through those activities, which returns to the biosphere, which ultimately damages it and undermines its ability to provide those same services. So it argues that, that this is fundamental. And if you accept this, because the biosphere is bounded, the global economy is bounded. So this reshapes our understanding of what truly sustainable growth and development looks like, and gives us I won't go through all the details of the model now, but kind of a way of formalizing that thinking. So to formalize this just briefly, the review presents a new model of the global economy embedded in the biosphere. And I don't know if you guys work with these sorts of models yourselves. Partha will often say that these sorts of models might to many people seem esoteric, but in his view, they're really important because they shape our conception of our place in the planet, and are in turn shaped by that. So, and it is true that economists in planning commissions or ministries of economics and finance, international organizations, business, are using these kinds of models, whether explicitly or implicitly, to analyze data and to forecast trends and to evaluate options and design policy. So I think it is really important and relevant. I've been convinced. So this slide shows a formal representation of the model. And so for those familiar with traditional macro growth models like the Solo model, it's similar. It's got a couple of important adjustments I'll touch on. So it builds on this fact that the processes governing the supply of regulating services are complementary to one another. So if one of them is disrupted sufficiently, the others will be disrupted as well. And although it acknowledges, and we might get more into this in the discussion, the possibility of substitution among different factors of production, including some aspects of natural capital, it takes these complementarities really seriously. So it keeps a tab on these different factors that are underlying our human impact on the biosphere and our waste and so on. And so if you get into the actual details of the equation, natural capital or nature makes its appearance in the production function in two forms. So as a stock, which is capital S, a stock of natural assets that are supplying these regulating and maintenance services in the form of a global public good. So it appears like a multiplicative factor, like total factor productivity normally would. And that's absent in Partha's understanding, in our understanding, from nearly all contemporary economic growth and development models. And it captures this fact that the human economy is embedded. You know, if life in the oceans were to disappear, human life would disappear. So it needs to appear in that form, because all economic production ultimately relies on those regulating services that are so fundamental. And the second place it appears may be more familiar as a flow of extracted provisioning services. That's R. So that's what we take from the biosphere directly: the fish, the water, the fibers, the food. Whereas the S is reflecting the carbon and nitrogen cycles, the climate regulation, soil regeneration, and everything. So yes, the review is using this to explore the possibilities of staying in a safe zone, using the planetary boundaries framing and having a kind of constraint that you wouldn't want to shift out of that safe zone to an unproductive state. And there are many implications of this that I'm sure we pull out in the review, and many others are going to pull out in the years to come. Two I just highlight that are interesting insights from this, that we've taken from it. One is that an increasing rate of environmental degradation, if you don't recognize this in a standard solar model, increasing environmental degradation can be misinterpreted as an increase in knowledge and institutional improvement. So your usual total factor productivity can be giving you the wrong signals. And And yeah, the other insight is that it sets limits to the extent we can increase our efficiency, particularly in returning waste to the biosphere. So it sets a sort of frame of yes, technology is important, but also realism in what technological advancement can achieve, and that we also need to be addressing the other aspects of that impact equation I showed you earlier, our human numbers and our overall economic activity. So then a brief word on valuation. I'm sure many of you will be experts on valuation. I know valuation is a big part of the field for environmental economists, and I've been involved in it myself. And many of you might have seen some of the commentary about the review since it was published. I personally believe it's wrong to take away from the review a narrow conception, an idea that has a narrow conception of value. I think it reflects multiple sources and conception of value. And indeed, if you read chapter 12, which is our valuation chapter, I think almost half, or maybe even more than half, is on nature's existence value and intrinsic worth, looking at sacredness and some deep philosophical perspectives on that. So you know, it covers a multiplicity of things, and it goes quite deep. Things you'll be familiar, sort of risks to human existence, risks to human health, use value, existence value, intrinsic value, all of that work. It doesn't provide a really detailed guide on how to do valuation. It briefly talks about the methods and will be quite superficial to many of you who are experts in it, but it gives a flavor of it. And I think it would be wrong, again, it's wrong to interpret it as primarily about values and valuation. This valuation chapter is important, but it's one of 21 chapters. And it sets valuation in the broader context of estimating accounting prices, these true values, because they're not visible in market prices. But that feeds into a broader framing around inclusive wealth, which I will now turn to. So the review recognizes that GDP remains an important economic indicator, particularly for short-run macroeconomic analysis. So it's not saying to get rid of GDP. And it also acknowledges that GDP, other people for years have acknowledged that GDP alone is not a sufficient measure of prosperity and economic success. So it's joining, I guess, a call that many others have made to think about other indicators. It makes the similar critique, I think, to others of GDP, that it ignores that depreciation of natural capital, and it's a flow rather than a stock measure, so it cannot be used to measure social well-being or the sustainable prosperity, what's sustainable over time. So Partha in the review builds on his previous work on what's called inclusive wealth, this inclusive measure of wealth, which the review argues should be our primary measure of economic success. So for those of you who don't know inclusive wealth, it's the social value based on these accounting prices, rather than market prices of an economy's total stock of natural, produced and human capital assets. And it's useful because it enables us to see the benefits of investing in natural assets and illuminate some of these trade-offs. And one of the attractive properties for Partha of this comes from a theorem that he produced, which shows that inclusive wealth mirrors changes in intergenerational well-being. So if we're increasing our inclusive wealth in this comprehensive way, we know it will be moving lockstep with social well-being over the generations. So there's a beauty to that. There's a cohesion to that in terms of being our main measure of economic progress and success. And natural capital accounting is obviously, which again many people will be involved in on this call, a prerequisite to that, the accounting for natural assets. Not only have we seen our natural assets depleted, but that accounting is still, despite many efforts by many people to improve it, it's improving, but it's still, I would say, still a significant gap in much of our decision making.